The category is What the Trans Darling.
Hello, welcome to What the Trans.
What the trans?
What the trans is going on? How are you doing, Ashley?
Oh, well, you know I am alright. I'm doing my phone voice for some reason. Yes, I've been getting better. I mentioned last time I haven't been feeling so super. I've been getting better. So very much peppermint tea. How about you?
I'm alright. So, weeks ago, I woke up one morning and I was very, very angry at the state of things with trans people, which is something that happens fairly regularly, I think, to everyone who listens. So I just did what so many other people have done. I just went on Twitter and made this rant, and it turned into a 70-tweet rant about
I saw.
Essentially, my entire career as a journalist has been covering this. I started in 2015 just as things started to go wrong. And then it went a bit viral, which was surprising to me because I just thought it was a rant. And then loads of people were like, oh, I can't believe you put so much work into this. I was like, well, I kind of did, but over a very long period of time. And then that became a thing on Pink News, which came out.
Yes.
And it's a lot smarter and stuff. It's not quite got, well, the original tweet was very badly spelled, was missing words because I wrote it in a rant, and I can't write. That's why I joined you in doing this podcast, because I can't write. I can't spell. But yeah, now it's become a thing on Pink News, which basically details kind of how this happened. And I mean, it's great. It's really great that people have been coming to me saying, oh, well done for writing this thing. But I think the thing I really want this to do, and I don't know if I'm putting way too much into my ability to write words down, is for it to be put in front of people who have no fucking idea this is happening. So they could know about it. So listeners, honestly, if you know anyone in your life that just has no idea what is happening and you wanted a 5-year covering explainer of what this is, go check the link in the description and spread it out. I'm astonished. I was astonished for a very long time that it seemed like a lot of people didn't know this, and it's one of those things where I knew it, but I thought because I knew it, everyone did, and it turned out not everyone does.
Yes. I experienced that as well, and then sometimes I find myself getting slightly annoyed. How do you not know about this? And it's like, well, actually, how would they? If we're not moving in the same circles, we're not checking at the same sources, and if they're not working specifically on a trans podcast that intentionally and deliberately covers these things that I then have to read about, of course they're not going to know about it. But yes, it is a very good article. It breaks it all down very nicely, easy to read. I've shared it about. We've put it on our Facebook and our Twitter account. So if there is anybody that you know, dear listener, who is a little bit confused as to how we have ended in this sorry state, share that with them, because it genuinely does kind of outline everything that happened and the influences on it, and does so really quite clearly, and it's not even a particularly long read. So well done. Genuinely, Michelle, that's some good journalisming.
I mean, thanks, but it weirdly doesn't feel like I did that much, because whilst I have done a lot, all of this stuff was just there. Because, I've said before on the podcast, this kind of started from the 2015 Trans Equality Inquiry in Parliament.
I remember.
And that was one of the first things I did when I was at Pink News, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. It was completely blind luck I was even there. And I think a lot of people have come into this around the consultation, 2017, 2018. That's when they jumped in and started to notice something was going wrong. But really, it had been going on for a lot longer than that. And for some reason, a lot of people didn't know that, but I did. And only a few people did, which is why I was surprised that it took off like that, because I was just like, how did you not know that? But then obviously, they didn't accidentally end up falling ass backwards into the middle of Parliament. Like that. There is a picture out there of me shaking hands with Nicky Morgan that I have now put out there myself, just to be like, look, full disclosure, I know what I'm talking about because I was there. Look, there's photographic proof I was there. So if you want to cancel me for that, listeners, I'll entirely understand.
So, moving slightly towards perhaps the substance of the episode, of course, regular listeners of the show will know that last week we spent the entire episode talking about the recent judicial review into the Tavistock and Portman rather, case which was referred to in legalese as Bell V Tavistock, where basically one person who'd had a rough experience ruined it for everybody.
With some help.
Definitely with some help, which we detailed in the last episode. We talked about the legal case itself, we talked about what it consisted of, who contributed to it, and we also had a nice long interview with Jolyon Malm from the Good Law Project, which was good. Very, very pleased with that episode. It went very well, and it laid everything out very clearly. This week, we are stepping away from the legal elements of the case and talking about the more personal elements of it, the stuff that's genuinely having an impact on the ground. We mentioned last week and on several other occasions about a kind of freezing effect that judgments like this can have when actually organisations that are still entitled and expected to provide care then say, oh, well, actually, we don't know what we're doing, so we're going to just step away from it and try and not deal with it. That chilling effect is something that we have seen in the weeks and months since the judicial review dropped in early December. So that, and the personal experiences of that, and the people involved, is the focus of this week's episode. And thank you, dear listener, for joining us on this wild ride.
Yeah, this week we talked to a couple of young people, Alexander Pickett and Sonia Howells, about their experiences in and around the Tavistock. They are both adults now, but they tell us about their previous experiences with the GID service operating outside the Tavistock. And we also talked to Ashlyn Gillen, a 15-year-old trans girl, and her mother, Penny Gillen. Ashlyn Gillen is currently on puberty blockers, and there appears to be a lot of uncertainty about what is going to happen with her prescription. But before all of that, we talked to the good people at GenderGP. For full disclosure, before we get into this, Dr. Helen Weberly of GenderGP did
contribute to our crowdfunder.
Yeah.
If you recall, some months ago, we crowdfunded
like 2 years ago now, wasn't it?
God, it was, wasn't it? Ages ago, we did start a crowdfunder to get ourselves some new equipment, so we could acquire the equipment we are using at this very moment: shiny new microphones and solid-state laptops that are very quiet. And it must be said, in the interest of full disclosure, Helen Weberly did contribute to that. Very kindly.
Yeah, she contributed £150, which is a very, very wonderful thing. But we want to put that up front so you know that we are, at least attempting to be transparent, but it doesn't really affect how we do things. It didn't really come into the interview in any way. And
no, it didn't, did it?
It won't influence our reporting on it, but just so you know up top, yeah, she gave us £150 like 2 years ago, basically. GenderGP offers services privately for trans people as well as trans young people, and have become something of a campaigning group as well as providing healthcare services to the trans community. We sat down with founder Dr. Helen Weberly and their in-house lead therapist Marianne Oakes for their take on the Bell versus Tavistock judgment.
So first of all, to both of you, thank you very much for joining us to have a chat about this. Thanks for giving up your time. And obviously the first question that we've got, it may be quite obvious, but how has GenderGP actually been affected by this High Court decision?
Okay, well, I think the whole of the trans community and anybody who supports them, anybody who's advocating for them, providing services for them, sharing their pain and anguish has been affected by the High Court decision. No one saw it coming. Everyone knew it was kind of happening in the background and just trusted that the question as to whether puberty blockers are safe, effective, necessary, needed, that question was answered years ago by all the centres of excellence across the world. So the fact that it was coming up for discussion in the UK courts wasn't that surprising, I guess, because people are trying to impact trans healthcare. But, we just trusted that the NHS and that the centres of excellence across the world would just be convincing. And then when it struck, I think the whole world was just gobsmacked. Of course, the newspapers took it with great gusto. I won't judge whether they took it the right way or the wrong way. And of course, all patients, parents, families were absolutely devastated by the judgment. And then, of course, it was interpreted in different ways, wasn't it, Marianne? So some people interpreted that now it was kind of illegal to give puberty blockers. And some interpreted that means that all services will stop. And others interpreted that actually, well, this determination only actually applies to the people that were in court that day. by the Tavistock as the NHS provider. So there was a lot of confusion about, who it related to. In terms of what's happened with GenderGP, we were very, very busy in terms of our educational and advocacy arm. I'm not going to speak for the medical department because I don't belong to the medical department at the moment, but, I understand that GenderGP set up the fund to help anybody who was affected that wouldn't be able to necessarily afford private healthcare. And I do know that, that there's been a lot of people come to GenderGP for support and advice and healthcare options. I don't know, Marianne, I mean, you deal on a day-to-day basis with patients and the families. I don't know what your experience has been.
I've just noticed I've been doing a lot of work with young people that were already on the waiting list for GIDS. A lot of them have sat there patiently for years and years, and suddenly the court ruling just means the carpet's been pulled from under them. I want to say, sadly, there's only GenderGP they can reach out to. And I say sadly because that tells you a lot about the state of transgender healthcare in the UK. We shouldn't be the only people. I don't know if Helen would agree with that. And they come to us, and if I'm honest with you, I don't know what... Helen's far better qualified to say what the legal standpoint is. But the one thing I can say is that these children have had enough of talking. They've been talking for 2-3 years, some of them, and they come to me and I start asking questions and I feel at a loss. I'm not sure whether I'm going to trigger them. I'm not sure, what they've been put through already. All I know is we can just continue working hard to help them. So yeah, the dynamics changed, I think, in short.
It certainly has, and that's something that I've seen in the work that I've been doing. There's just kind of phrase that a lot of people used is the rug being pulled out from underneath, and it's sent people flying backwards, and nobody's quite sure what to do next.
Yeah, we interviewed Joe Moen from the Good Law Project last week, and he said very much the same in that he didn't see it coming. He didn't know anyone who did. And when it comes to Joe Moen, he is a man who would know what he's talking about because he's had a very long career in legal services. So I think if people like Joe couldn't see it coming, I don't think it makes sense that nobody saw it coming because I know I didn't. Dr. Weberly, this one is for you. There are arguments in the case from claimants about blockers, for example, that blockers being prescribed through the Tavistock almost 100% of the time resulting in later a hormone replacement therapy prescription being provided means that the blockers inherently cause the HRT prescriptions. And there are other claims as well, such as that they are experimental, that they...
Unproven.
Yes, that they are an unproven method of healthcare. What is your take on the claims that were given by the claimants in the case?
The claimants in the case, have a different agenda. And I think if the claimants and the interveners in the case had been good people who actually wanted the best outcome for trans and cis kids in the UK, then I think we would have been in a different playing field. But I think looking at the claimants, they had a different motive, and what the motive seems to be from both that case and the evidence that they produced in that case, but also wider afield, that actually limiting healthcare options for trans youngsters was one of the missions, however they wanted to navigate to achieve that end. There is definitely an association between starting blockers and then moving on to gender-affirming hormones. There is definitely a positive association in that virtually all young people who go on to blockers will go on to hormone replacement therapy or gender-affirming hormones. And that is because they are transgender. That is not because in any way blockers make you more trans or make you more likely to want gender-affirming hormones or make you less likely to try out your biological puberty again. It is because their diagnosis was right and that person was indeed transgender. In terms of being experimental and unproven, there is a lot of research and more is coming out all the time. If you have a look at what was available in 2000, there wasn't very much. If you look at what was available in 2010, there was a little bit. If you look at what was available in 2020, there's ample. When we look at what will be available in 2030, yes, there will be more. But that does not mean at all, like any branch of medicine, that what we have available in 2020 is inadequate or insufficient in any way. That's just not true. So experimental, no. Unproven, no. Do they lead on to hormone replacement therapy and gender-affirming hormones, we should call it really? Yes, they do, because the diagnosis was right.
Quite difficult to argue with that, really, and I'm astonished that actually went through the courts and was taken seriously as an argument.
The difficulty is that the courts, right at the beginning, you have a look at what they actually say that they were being asked to answer, and they were very clear in saying, we are not being asked to answer whether blockers are safe, effective, the right treatment for gender dysphoria, okay to use in young people. They weren't asked, the court wasn't asked to look at any of that, but that's what the interpretation has been of the determination. The court felt that they were being asked, given the information that the Tavistock service give young people, could young people consent to treatment? And that was the difficulty. And actually, the biggest problem is that the Tavistock Clinic, they haven't kept up with international guidelines. There are no UK published guidelines, they haven't kept up with international guidelines. There's a couple of really big differences, because the Tavistock protocol says that every single young person, regardless of age, has to go onto blockers first before they are permitted to access gender-affirming hormones. There's no other clinic in the world that does that, to my knowledge. But it isn't standard practice. And also the other thing that the Tavistock are doing is every single young person who starts treatment isn't allowed to start gender-affirming hormones until they're 16. And that means that if you put somebody on puberty blockers aged 9 or 10, which is what is happening, they will be on blockers until they're 16. And that's a very long time. And yes, that's different to the international centres of excellence, where you're only on blockers for a year or so. And so the judge was rightly worried to say, what happens? That's a long time to be on blockers. Does that kid know what they are consenting to at that stage? And so actually, where I feel that the Tavistock really let themselves down, where they didn't follow international guidelines, they were following their own clinic protocols. And that was shown up in court. And then looking at that evidence that was presented to the court, the judge said, well, actually, given what you're telling me today, I don't think that young people can consent to your information. And that's where they came down. So I think the appeal has got a big journey ahead of it, actually.
So do you believe that a judge in a court somewhere could have the ability to judge whether a child is indeed able to consent, more so than a doctor can?
I mean, that's a very interesting point, isn't it? And given the question like that, the obvious answer is no, because that judge isn't in the consulting room. That judge hasn't done this period of assessments. They're not sitting with the young person. So how can a judge give such a blanket view that's going to affect so many people? The difficulty is that the judge was asking the Tavistock, okay, up to about 30% of young people might be on the autistic spectrum. So that follows that they're knowing what we know about the autistic spectrum and the difficulties that can present, we would perceive that there may well be some young people on the autistic spectrum and also on the gender dysphoria spectrum who might have difficulty in persuading or being able to show that they have got capacity to consent. So without causing any disrespect to anybody with gender dysphoria or autism, we can understand that there might be people who would find it difficult to show that they've got capacity to consent. And so the judge said to the Tavistock, okay, in all of your patients, how many of the children that were on the autistic spectrum were not able to give consent? And the Tavistock said, well, we don't have that information. And then the court said, okay, well, how many times did you ask for parents to consent for the young person instead if they weren't able to? And the Tavistock said never. And the court said, how many times did you ask the court to intervene? Because we do know that sometimes when there are very difficult medical decisions to be made, applications will be made to the court to help. We've seen that in the news. And the Tavistock said, well, no, we haven't. We haven't asked the court to intervene at all. That is, you just got to admit it, that is a bit surprising that the Tavistock don't know how many autistic children weren't able to consent without the help of the parents or without the help of the courts. And so therefore it does throw a shadow of doubt over their consent procedures. The judge was asked, do you think the Tavistock procedures allow the information to be given to patients to be able to consent? And the judge said, well, no, I don't think so. When you actually unpick it in an impassionate way, you can understand why the court had to come to that decision. I don't agree with it at all. And I'm really shocked and surprised and hurt by it. But I can see how it arose.
Can I just interject? The thing that I think people aren't understanding, and correct me if I understand this was not about the medication. It wasn't about the treatment for young people. It was about the Tavistock and their protocols and how they determined who was suitable and who wasn't. And that the court judgment is basically saying that the Tavistock got it wrong. It's not saying that everybody that's who's using these treatments is getting it wrong. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's how I interpret it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and the sad part of this is that this is the NHS. This is probably the biggest single caregiver towards for transgender healthcare, certainly in the UK, probably one of the biggest in the world, to be fair. They've got the weight of the NHS, they've got the weight of the state behind them. And they failed against a tiny little group to prove that they knew what they were doing. And I think that is a reflection of where we are with transgender healthcare in the UK, that they weren't diligent enough. They didn't vet their clinicians to make sure. What's the motivation of the clinicians that are involved with the Tavistock? Do they believe that this is an illness that can be cured? Because I genuinely believe some of the clinicians do. And they just didn't listen to what was going on in the wider world. They just had this ideological belief that they could cure children. And I think the figures support that. Only 25% of people referred go through towards treatment. So what's happening to the other 75%? So there's a bigger question, I think, to be answered here. Why did it even get to court?
Yeah, from what people have told me, I've been talking to a lot of people in various ways, including a lot of people that wouldn't want to come on the podcast because they're too afraid. That's been a thing. Because we've been approaching lots of parents to try and get some young people on the show who can speak firsthand about what this is doing, who were either in the process of trying to get blockers or who had already started them and now their prescription is at risk. And that has been the message, that the Tavistock is failing in the opposite way that the claimants are saying. And the thing that I found really fascinating in the judgment was Kira Bell herself in the judgment said that it took her years and years to get all this stuff. And that just completely goes against everything else she was saying. Like, oh, they rushed me through. And I just couldn't help but think, you rallied for 2 years to get surgery, you just said. How? That doesn't add up. Something weird is going on there. But I mean, that's just me speculating. I don't know Kira Bell's story.
Indeed, yeah. So, well, yeah, thank you for that. And turning to you specifically for a moment, Marianne, and when it comes to your clients, obviously not wanting you to say anything that would breach confidentiality, but your clients, both young people and adults, what sort of effect has this judgment had on them?
Well, it's reinforced. How can I say? It's a bit like Brexit, if I can use that word. It's making people feel worried, they feel stigmatised, they feel that we are a burden on society. It's reinforcing everything that we've been working so long to move away from. So yeah, they're becoming frightened to talk to anybody. The one impact I'm having is people are frightened to talk to me. I'm going into sessions and they're going back to I'm a gatekeeper, and I have to work really hard to say, just be honest. Don't feel there's a right and a wrong. And I just think it's just set everything back. In terms of older people, I think it's definitely more about the stigma. I think it's more about, am I safe out in society? And I'm hearing parents, saying, will my child be safe? If they go through, is their life going to be harder? But, I think Helen will agree with me. We work really hard to say, no, it shouldn't be harder. We've got to have a positive. I think from the children's point of view, can you imagine? It's like watching your parents fight. It's like watching your parents pull each other apart, and how insecure you would feel in your own home. Well, imagine that's how you feel in society, watching the gender critic and the allies tear shreds out of each other. And in the middle of this is this little group of, I'll cry in a minute, I'm not going to lie.
I've been doing it all week, don't worry.
This little group of people that are lost, and that's what, in general, that's what we're facing in the therapy room.
That sounds like it's a lot to deal with, and that must be obviously quite hard on a personal level. And I think that's, rather than necessarily the specific effects of the judgment and how that is being applied by the Tavistock and by the NHS more broadly, but as you say, that embattled feeling of caught between two thorns kind of thing, just feeling lost, not quite sure. And that's definitely had an effect on all the trans adults that I know and associate with and who are my friends. We're all talking and worried about this, and, doom scrolling is a word that is popping up. We're all just, because it was so unexpected.
It's this the thin edge of a big wedge that if it actually carries on now, where's this going to end up? And the adults, we are all in the firing line.
I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's not often I see Marianne nearly in tears, but, where do those tears come from? And actually, if you look at the chain, so Marianne sees the parents and the families and the children in her consulting room, and then that's for an hour at a time, maybe once a week or whatever support. But if you imagine and those tears are coming from that. Imagine what it's like to be in that family, in that household, all day, all night, and with parents petrified for their kids and what will happen to their kids, and also being so frustrated, which is what I think that you are saying, is that frustration. What do we do? How can we help? What can we do? Just imagine what it's like inside those houses. Everyone's saying, I don't know what to do. Where do we go? What do we do? What is going to happen? What is going to happen to my child? Not just today, or will my child be there in the morning, but what's going to happen over the next 3, 5, 10 years as puberty just marches on relentlessly? And what impact is that going to have?
Just one other point here. This is something that just came into my mind while Helen was speaking there. Don't get me wrong, I get the tears of a trans woman. As a counsellor and a professional, the one thing I can offer is a safe space, and that definitely is good. But the one thing that's come into the sessions that I do, whether it's a pathway session, whether it's counselling, social services are gearing up now. GPs, if you're going to put your child on puberty blockers, the reporting families to the bloody social services, the knock-on effect of that court judgment is making everybody nervous. I've spoken to somebody this morning, without giving a confidence away, but the truth of the matter is all the care around a particular child are suddenly don't want to touch. They're being told by CAMS to go away. The GP's telling them to go away. Nobody wants to touch this now because of that court judgment. And the threat is social services. And some poor mother or father is now trying to tell their child they're going to look after them, and actually social services are coming and saying that you're an abusive parent with no evidence. The only abuse is coming from the clinical side of things. So yeah, that is a dynamic that's changed.
They call that a chilling effect, don't they, as everybody gets very nervous about providing services that are still ostensibly allowed, but because of that judgment and the heat around it and the discourse, it's causing people to, as you say, get very, very nervous.
I know that I'm feeling very, very angry, and I do have this urge that I want to try and help in some way, and our audience tends to skew young. We have listeners of all ages, but it tends to skew in like early 20s to 30s, kind of most of where our listeners are, and they don't know a trans kid most of the time. They may not have even met one unless they bumped into one at a Pride when we could do those. I think there's going to be a lot of adults listening who are just like, I want to help somehow. I want to support these kids and support the parents of these kids, but they have no idea how. In your opinion, what can our listeners do to support trans youth at the moment?
What we need to do is counter the balance that Marianne was talking about. So there's a weight of people who are scared, either being passive and not doing anything, just stepping back, or being active in apparently protecting these abused children. Of course, I've got my fingers up in inverted commas. And what we need to do is balance that out with the other side of people who absolutely understand that being trans is not something you make up. Being trans is not something that you choose. This is not what you make your children. You're not abusing your children. You're just, by supporting your children, you're doing what parents should do: support their children to explore their childhood and themselves as they grow up. And so we need those voices. All of those young trans adults that you were talking about, I love that age group because they're really passionate. You see them all at the university, at college. They're in the groups. They've got their banners out. They've got their flags out. We need them to do that. We need them to tell us and tell the world what it was like when they were a trans kid. And if they had had access to the kind of care that is available or should be available now, what difference it would have made to their lives. That no one made them be trans, and their parents weren't abusive, that when they supported them, when they said they were coming out and they wanted to wear this instead of wear that, or be called this instead of be called that. We need to hear those stories so that other people, I've heard all those stories firsthand as a doctor. Marianne's heard them all because she listens to people all day, every day. That's her job. But the rest of the community and society haven't heard these stories. We need to hear these stories, that this is just a normal percentage of society. This is just 10% of our society is queer in some way, or whatever percentage it is. And then the other thing that these young people need to do is fly the flag and not put up with it. And, they are the voters of tomorrow. And we've got to start asking the people that look after GPs who are scared, the people who look after social workers who are scared, the people who look after decision makers. We need those people, the high people, the regulators, the lawyers, the government. We need those people to step in and offer us protection. And so those young people out there need to be demanding that our regulators and our institutions and our governments offer that protection to school teachers, social workers, GPs, doctors, to safely provide the care and the support that we need.
Marianne, do you have any ideas on what people listening could do to support trans youth and the parents at the moment?
I have a controversial viewpoint. One of the reasons we're in this position and what needs to change. Part of the gender critical movement is to silence us, to stop us being visible. And the more they're doing that, the more invisible we're becoming. It's interesting that you said a lot of your listeners won't know a trans child. I would say to anybody who says they've never met a trans person, you have. You just don't know you have. This idea that we are not there it's just a myth. What did somebody say to me recently? Oh, we did a podcast with the great Neville Southall, and he said, about trans people in sport. And I said, well, I did sport. The fact I wasn't visibly trans doesn't mean to say I wasn't a trans person in sport. The reality is, I think we've got to start and stop being ashamed. We talk about pride. Pride can be the dirty side of shame, that we'll turn up at a pride event and we'll be loud and proud. And then we go back on Monday morning and we go back to dull and we hide our trans. I just think visibility for me is everything. And I think, children are suffering because we do still tend to be less visible. So yeah, we should be outside Parliament now with our masks on, socially distancing, leafleting MPs as they walk in. I think the other thing we've done, we've been silenced. We refuse to go on and debate with the gender critics on the news. That's played against us. We've got to change our narrative. We've got to go on and speak, do it on our terms. Let's stop answering the gender critics. I heard a great phrase from somebody on Facebook. They'd been asked to do an interview on This Morning or something, and Amanda Holden must have been on there. And before they went on, they said, I don't care what Piers Morgan asks you. You've got 7 minutes to say what you want to say. Don't answer his questions. Don't engage with him. Just use that 7 minutes to say what you want to say. And I think we've got to start and get back out there, and we've got to start putting our narrative out. How we do that, and here's me up in the northwest, not outside Parliament. That's what I think needs to start happening now, that we've got to stop hiding away. We've got to be trans, we've got to be proud, and we've got to be out there. We've got to take that risk. Like I say, controversial.
No, I think there's going to be a lot of people who think along the same lines, and I've talked to a lot of people who have said that particular thing about not debating it in the media has been a mistake. I've spoken to so many who now think that, and I'm in two minds myself. I don't know what the right way is, but I don't think anyone is necessarily wrong when they say that. So I don't think the statement is as controversial as you may believe it is, Marianne. I think it's going to be a more common one. But anyway, thank you so much for giving us your time. And
yes, thank you to both of you. Genuinely.
Good luck for the days to come.
Yeah, and thank you for the work you do. Marianne said we need to be waving the flag and standing up there and be proud to be trans. And programs like this is what this does. It gives the opportunity. I know I'm not trans, but I speak for those that have told me their story. Podcasts like this that can do that education and allay those fears. So thanks so much for having us both on.
Our pleasure, and I'm sure we shall speak again.
So they are fine. They don't sound at all a little bit peeved at everything that's going on.
No, certainly not. Why would anybody be, understandably, a little bit annoyed?
Yeah, well, you can check out the link in the description to check out everything GenderGP is about. But anyway, what's the next thing? The
next thing is, it's an interview that we did with 2 trans adults who are actually recent adults who in fact went through the Tavistock system. So we wanted to get some idea of how the GIDS service actually worked in quote-unquote normal times. So we spoke to 2 trans adults, Alexander Pickett and Sonia Howells, about their experiences coming out and transitioning as young people and going through the Tavistock. So let's play the tape. Well, first of all, thank you to both of you for giving us your time and agreeing to speak to us about this. And first question, really, it's a little bit more of a check-in more than anything else, which is, how are you feeling at the moment?
Very stressed. Yeah, I recently moved house, sorting out all the like adulty stuff, like sorting out council tax. Very boring.
All the fun stuff. But, I mean, how are we getting on? How are we doing okay, kind of thing? How about you, Alex?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, nice and brave.
I mean, that's good that you're both doing okay, because the news over the last couple of months has not exactly been great. And both of you have specific experiences with the Tavistock. Would you like to tell us about your experiences with that infamous clinic?
Yeah, so my experiences have been limited because of the waiting list. I came out in 2014, but the process of even getting a referral, I wasn't referred until February in 2018. So it took nearly 4 years to actually get a referral to the Tavistock. And then I was on the waiting list since February 2018. And then during that time, then I aged up over and went to the adult services and got seen at the adult services in December in 2020. So that was from the time that I came out as trans 6 years until I actually got seen at the NHS.
What was the hold-up? Like, was this the GP getting in the way? How did it take 4 years to get a referral?
Well, I was under CAMS, and I did come up to the psychologist and stuff, and they didn't really do anything about it. I had one psychologist who said, okay, what do you want to be called? Do you want to be called your dead name or Alex? I said, I want to be called Alex. And then she said, okay, dead name. So there wasn't really much understanding at all. And it just kind of went on and on and on. And yeah, nothing ever got done until 4 years later. Then finally I got referred to like a gender counsellor and got referred to TAVI.
This is CAMS Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services in East London, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you didn't ever even get there. That's astonishing that you started. How old were you when you started?
Well, I was referred when I was 16. And then when you get to about 17 and a half, then they then refer you over to the adults.
I mean, brilliant.
Yes.
That's just round of applause for GIDS / the Tavistock Clinic / Tavistock and Portland Trust. All round, that sounds like a particularly challenging experience for you.
Yeah.
How about you, Sonia?
Mine's relatively similar, actually. I've spoken about this before, but the referral process for me was actually pretty quick. From when I came out in sort of March 2017, I spoke to my GP sort of in the summer of that year, and then they were like, I don't know what to do. It sounds like a mental health issue, so we'll refer you to CAMS, which is where I had to go anyway. Then CAMS, it went through really quick at CAMS. They were like, from the initial assessment, everything sounds good. Doesn't sound like there's any pre-existing mental health issues that we have to worry about. So we'll refer you to the TAVI. I was on the waiting list for Tavistock from November 2017 to end of December 2019, to where they said, we're not going to see you by the time you turn 18. So which adult clinic do you want to go to? And I asked to go to Nottingham because it was between Nottingham and London, for which is the closest. And I didn't really want to travel to London every couple of months. So, and since then, I've been on the waiting list for Nottingham.
So in terms of experiences with the Tavistock, it's actually quite limited, isn't it? In both of your cases. And that is something that we're finding people saying that quite a lot, which is shocking, really. It really does highlight the endemic nature of the problems within UK trans healthcare. I mean, that's just about waiting lists without getting onto anything else.
It's like from my sort of referral process is like one of the quickest that I've heard of when speaking to people. And yet I still am waiting to be seen by an NHS clinic. Like it got to a point of me waiting to where I was like, I can't wait anymore. I will happily go bankrupt and go private. And now I have sort of done a weird hybrid system of going private and not, just to be prescribed hormones.
So, given what you've both just said, and Going to you to start with, Alex. Do you think that your experiences of, within the trans healthcare system and within the Tavistock specifically, overall, do you think those experiences match up with what people like Keira Bell and others have claimed about the service?
Not at all. I think to kind of claim that you're being rushed through just doesn't make any sense at all, because it's you're not even being seen. Never mind, even if you do get seen, then you still have to go through loads of assessments before you can get onto any medication at all. So I think it's way too slow. So to say that it needs to be even slower is just absurd.
Sonia, do you have anything to add?
I've obviously spoken before about the fact that I completely disagree with the overarching sort of message of it's a quick process, that it's really speedy, they push you on hormones, that it's a one-track system. That's just not the case. It never has been, probably never will be. Let's be real. It's from sort of speaking to people who have actually gone to the Tavistock clinic, it's at least 3 assessments that are very deeply invasive and ask questions that really aren't relevant. And it's not a quick process. Like, it's years on a waiting list to then at least sort of half a year-ish doing assessments. There's nothing quick about trans healthcare in the UK.
And how can anybody claim that there is?
It's false. It's blatant lies.
So what do you imagine the psychological cost will be to trans youths who are currently trying to go through the system now that the High Court has made this decision?
We're already seeing the psychological effects. Speaking from personal experience, not having the access to healthcare or the specialists that I need has a huge detrimental effect on my mental health. The difference between me now and me like a year and 2 months ago, before I started to sort of envelop myself in like the trans world in a public setting, we're completely different people. My mental health back then was at the lowest it could be. And that is purely for the fact that I wasn't being seen by anyone that could help me. So it's the only way it's going to get better is to actually help people. And this ruling is not helping anyone.
Pretty much the same as what Sonia was saying, that, it's hard enough for kids to be trans anyway. And then just the added pressures of not getting any medical help, and obviously it's time critical, because if you're delaying the treatment, then you're just going to be having to go through a puberty that you don't want and having to deal with the consequences of that. And it's seen as it's okay to go through your natal puberty and go through the long-term consequences of that, but pausing it is somehow really extreme. And I think my mental health was really poor when I was waiting to be seen at the Tavistock, and then when I went privately for treatment because I had no other option, then my mental health went a lot better. It's just sort of the waiting and having to deal with every day waking up with really bad dysphoria. No child should have to go through all of that when it's so easily sorted by just having access to treatment.
Yeah, I remember when I was a teen, and that was a very stressful time for me. Not just because I was in the closet or anything, or any kind of dysphoria stuff, just because being a teen, anywhere between 13 and 19, is a terrifying time. You have to make a lot of decisions with a lot of pressure. You are kind of in a halfway point where people expect you to act like you know more about certain things than you possibly could. I just feel that teens get a raw deal in general, and then to add all of this shit on top, it's just not right.
I went to a sort of semi-accepting school when I came out as trans, and I came out sort of towards the tail end of year 10, beginning of year 11. So I can it was tough for me in the environment that I was given, but I could only imagine the immense pressure that it is just to be trans, especially in the younger years of secondary school, because it's a horrible place. I remember that it was there were days where I would not go to school because I was terrified of being picked on.
Yeah. And that, unfortunately, that's, I think, the high school experience for trans and queer youth generally is something that is improving by degrees, but is kind of nowhere near fast enough. And although there are organisations like the one I work for that specifically support trans youth and the school system and so on, it's just not enough. And I absolutely echo from my experience at high school 20 years ago that, yeah, there are some days, and even before being out as trans, you're still being marked out as different, and it makes you sick to your stomach. You don't want to go to school. Sometimes you kind of physically can't, and all that sort of thing. However, time marches on, and we do see progress, even if people try and fight against that progress and drag it back to the dark ages through the courts. But final question for both of you, and this is the $1 million question for us and our listeners, really, which is, so how can we adults provide support for trans youth at the moment, bearing in mind your experiences? What can we olds do? Alex?
Well, I suppose not act as if transitioning and being trans is some sort of negative outcome to avoid. I think, a lot of the debate around puberty blockers and stuff is kind of based on, nearly 100% of kids on puberty blockers go on to cross-sex hormones. And it's kind of being portrayed as this negative outcome, that it's a bad thing that at the end of puberty blockers, people still want to transition. But, it's not a bad thing at all. It's just a natural part of human variation, and I think acting like that around your kids and young people that is really important, so that they don't feel like they're kind of some sort of freak or whatever, because it's just another part of being human.
So what would you say to our listeners who are young adults but don't know any trans kids directly? How do you think they could help support trans kids and the parents of those kids?
I guess kind of put yourself in the position of what you were like as a teen, whether you're trans or not, and how hard it was for you to be a child growing up and a teenager with all of that extra, school pressure and everything, and then think about how much easier it would be if you were able to go through the correct puberty at the same time as your peers, because puberty is hard enough as it is when it's the correct puberty for you, and also try to support charities like Mermaids that help young trans people and their families, because for families like myself, my mum at first wasn't accepting, and charities like Mermaids were vital in helping my mum to accept me, and then I could move forward with my life.
Give Mermaids money. Give Gendered Intelligence money, people who are listening. Sonia, do you have anything to add?
I think it's just important to stress that being trans is beautiful. It's such a hard thing for anyone to go through, and I don't think anybody willingly wishes it upon anyone. But there's beauty in that it's a shared experience that a huge cohort of people can experience. And I guess also for our cis allies and people who sort of aren't touched by the trans experience, is to just be vocal, be sort of educated on it, and help with the sort of the fight for just basic equality.
Genuinely, thanks both for joining us, and we will speak to you again soon, and have a lovely next few days. So I think it was good for us to kind of get that insight, and definitely to ask the question, what can we olds, us trans adults, do to actually provide support at this extremely anxious time for a lot of trans people? And genuinely, if you are listening, Alexander and Sonia, thank you so much for sitting down with us and sharing those details.
Yeah, I should point out that they have actually I've been talking to them for the best part of a year to get them on the pod in some form. I originally asked the press guy at Mermaids if he could help us out with a couple of young trans people to talk about, at the time, just generic trans youth stuff.
Yeah.
And then we went on hiatus, and episodes kept getting pushed back and pushed back, and I've kind of been messing them around for the best part of a year. So seriously, Alex, Sonia, you are the most patient people I've ever met. Thank you so much for letting me mess you around for the best part of a year, and I hope it was worth it for you. And I think it will be for our listeners because, well, I mean, it's not exactly a story that a lot of people would hear. And I think it's easy for trans adults without trans kids to just be like, well, how does this affect me? I mean, what's the deal? I mean, I've got too much. I've got these X other number of things, and the Times has come out with a new transphobic thing.
Yeah.
My boss is being a dick because he won't let me use my pronouns on the shop floor, things like that. Do I have the bandwidth to care about this? And it's like, we should fucking care about this because we were them, right? Like, everyone listening to this who is trans was a trans kid. At some point.
How it works, And I would say as well, thank you to all 4 of our preceding interviewees for putting up with me conducting the interview while wearing a Starfleet tunic because it's a nice, warm, comfortable top with lovely sleeves. And I was like, well, I'm just going to put this on and hope no one mentions it. But, of course, rumbled.
I'm sorry about that, but I have said to you so many times, on and off air, you should absolutely make Starfleet uniforms part of your regular clothing rotation. I'm surprised this is still a debate. In fact, listeners, let's start a hashtag. Ashley is the commander. I mean, they have commanders, right? That's what...
they do, yeah.
Picard's second guy was a...
Yeah, Commander Riker. It's usually like the first officer or something. But also Dr. Crush. No, I am not doing this. I am not talking about Starfleet ranking systems. Let us move on. All
right, let's move on to our final interview, which was with Ashlyn Gillen, a 15-year-old trans teen, and her mother, Penny Gillen. Ashlyn has been directly affected by the Bell v Tavistock judgment, as she has been on puberty blockers since she was 12 years old, and the future for her medication looks a little uncertain. Let's play the tape. Hello, Penny and Ashton. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Hi, Michelle.
Hey there. Thank you for having us.
It's all good. So I guess the most obvious question is, how have the last couple of months been for you?
The judgment, the Bell Tavistock judgment, was obviously hugely concerning. And I must admit, as mum, when it landed, I couldn't talk about it for 24 hours. I just felt sick to my stomach, worrying what the impact would be. I didn't talk to you about it initially. I'm not sure when you became aware.
I didn't find out about it for quite a while, actually. I don't read the news. It's so depressing.
You are very, very wise. Just because when we started the podcast, we had a segment, we as a joke, called like a little news roundup at the beginning of the podcast, Terrible News. We started in late 2017. With the consultation that happened the next year, you could see how Terrible News became a literal description.
I think that's it for us. We've made a conscious decision. The stuff that we see in the mainstream press doesn't bear any relation to the life.
It's not something I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah.
But when the Kira Bell judgment came through, it was very different because it wasn't just somebody's opinion. Like, it was an actual legal sort of document, I think. I didn't keep up with stuff like that. But it was like a piece of paper that could actually take away a lot of things that could benefit me. So it was a lot more concerning than other stuff that I see is.
So Ashlyn, do you currently have a prescription for a puberty blocker of some kind?
Yes. I take the 10-week one. I actually have an appointment tomorrow to go get it done. But yes, I do. And I've been on it since I was 12, actually.
And you are 15 now, is that right?
Yeah.
So it's been quite a while. Can you tell us how you managed to secure this prescription? Like, I know that this may be a very, very long story.
Yeah. So it started out back in 2015, maybe.
Probably, or even earlier. You were 8 when you came out.
I came out when I was 8 in a car, which probably wasn't the best choice. And my mum, I don't know if Dad was there as well, but my mum took me to CAMS, completely unhelpful, to be as blunt as possible. And they told me, because I brought up my sister quite a lot, and they told me that I was just trying to be close to my sister, or something like that. The details are a bit hazy.
Yeah, it was a bit crappy, wasn't it? We had 3 CAMS assessments before we got our Tavistock referral, and which just speaks volumes about how under-resourced and how little training CAMS have. I think
each of them were a year apart, which was a very long wait for me as somebody who just wanted to, what I thought was fixing myself. And so the second time we went, about the same thing happened. They didn't take me seriously.
Yeah.
And I wasn't like sort of really out in terms of like at home yet. We weren't using my new name or anything at that point. And then a year later, we went again, and we were a lot more upfront about what we wanted. And I dressed in girls' outfits, used my girl name, and not that clothes have any gender or anything, but I dressed in more feminine outfits, used my female name.
And got the referral.
I got the referral.
Which is in of itself slightly crazy, that you have to, Ashlyn was a jeans and hoodies kid,
Definitely.
but she had to present in a more feminine way on her third appointment, each appointment being a year apart, to actually be taken seriously was just bonkers.
Once you overcame the hurdles of the child and adolescent mental health services, what kind of experience did you have with the Tavistock itself, the GID service?
For me, and it's quite different for other people, but I thought at first that the Tavistock was actually really great.
Yeah.
We had appointments every month, which was a lot more frequent than it had been before.
Yeah. You connected with your therapist.
Definitely.
Which I think made you more
very helpful.
You were more willing, you were open, very open with them. And again, I think this is a problem with the judgment. Ashlyn is someone who has been through the Tavistock in a reasonably effective manner, right?
Yeah.
Referred at 11. At that point, the waiting lists were a lot shorter. They were still obscene. We waited 9-10 months. But then once she was seen, had great therapists who were just there to listen, ask questions, explore, had our intense assessment over a 6-8 month period, and was referred for blockers and got blockers at the right Tanner stage, the right pubertal stage. Yeah. And has been on them since.
It was great, definitely for me for the first part, but it got quite tiring quite fast, having to go and answer the same questions every single time and talk about fertility. And I was always very clear that I didn't want children, but I understand from an outside perspective, an 11-year-old saying that they don't want to have children might seem quite unreasonable. But obviously at the time, I wasn't thinking like that. And I don't think any 11-year-olds in my position now are thinking like that either. And they shouldn't really have to, because like when I said it, I was dead serious that I didn't want children. So I imagine that they're dead serious that they don't want children as well.
Yeah.
Not saying that all 11-year-olds don't want children though.
I know that I did not want children when I was 11 years old. That's one thing that was definitely for sure.
Yeah. And you still don't want children at 15?
I still don't want children.
Like, I've heard from others that they have had positive experiences. I have also heard that there have been many, many negative experiences with the Tavistock.
And we know people who've had negative experiences. You can imagine, when Ashlyn came out, I didn't know a trans person, as far as I'm aware.
And you Googled.
And I Googled like mad. And my knowledge of trans people came from the media, which is pretty horrific in lots of cases. But here we are, kind of 6-7 years later, and we know a lot of families.
Is that through groups like Mermaids and Gendered Intelligence and things like that, groups like that?
Yeah, Ashlyn went to her first Gendered Intelligence support group.
11.
Yeah, at 11. And
it was really helpful, really nice. And I made a lot of friends there that I'm still quite close with now.
Yeah, and I think that helps, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But everybody's experience is different. And I think at this point with the Bell judgment, Ashlyn's age works in her favour. So looking at it from a kind of legal parental perspective, when it landed, there was a part of me thinking, oh shit, they're going to take her medication away. And she's due her next blocker in a week's time. What do we do? There was another part of me thinking, they can't just stop a medical treatment. That would be completely unethical. And so far, our experience, Ashlyn's already said she's getting a blocker this week. So our experience has been they're communicating clearly with us. There's a process that will be followed. An assessment will need to happen. The appeal is taking place. So Ashlyn's age means that our family is lucky, but it shouldn't be about luck.
Yeah.
So we know 13-year-olds.
I was just about to
Go
say,
on, yeah.
We know 13-year-old girls and boys and anything in between, and their appointments have been cancelled, and I don't think that's fair for them, because I can think about how devastating that would have been for me. In some ways I am quite grateful that I'm 15 and I'll be turning 16 in a few months' time.
So they're going to give you a assessment. Is that from a clinician at the Tavistock, or is that going to be from someone else?
It will be combined. So we, again, I think this is an example of how poor trans healthcare is generally, and even more so with, I think, young people. We have to go into London to get Aislin's blocker because our GP just refuses to have anything to do with her care because they say that they aren't qualified and they don't understand. So when we go in, sometimes we just go in and get an injection. Sometimes we go in and we see the endocrinologist and someone from the TAVI. So it's always a multidisciplinary approach. It's always combined. We were left hanging, and then we got a letter saying we will not stop healthcare. We will not stop your treatment. We will need to hold further assessments and then make the best case interest to the judge. If Aislinn agrees, you mum agree, we the clinicians agree. So almost if you get every tick in the box, then you go forward to a judge, but we don't know when that will be. We're just telling you we will have to do it at some point. And in the meantime, we won't stop your blocker.
Kind of hoping that the assessment will happen after I've turned 16, but it's probably unlikely.
I mean, that sounds so anxiety-inducing.
Kind of, yeah.
It's crap, right?
How are you making peace with all of this? Because, I can guarantee if I was in your position, I would not be nearly as stoic as you two appear to be about the situation.
It feels like I have been through a similar process to what I'm going to have to do back when I was 11, 12. So in my head, I'm thinking if I did it when I was 11 and 12, I'll be able to do it now. But obviously, it's going to be different.
Yeah.
But I've always been quite confident.
I think being older and being able to show levels of maturity will be paramount in this process, which again immediately disadvantages some families and some young people, doesn't it? Right. So Aislinn told us who she is, and we believe her because I don't know how Aislinn feels day to day unless she tells me. But I am very clear that this is my daughter's life and she has autonomy, and my role as mum is to make sure that she is informed of all the risks and all the advantages at every step of the way so that she can make informed decisions. But the kids who don't have supportive families, or the kids who are neurodiverse and not able to articulate in quite the same way, are immediately disadvantaged by this process. And I just think it's an outrageous process.
Will the actual seeing the judge element of this incur any kind of financial cost to you?
We have no idea, and I don't think we'll see a judge. I imagine it will be a bit like GRCs, and a bank of evidence will be provided, but we genuinely don't know. Nobody is communicating with us because I think nobody knows at this point.
So when it comes to the general mood around your fellow trans friends in your age bracket, what tends to be the most common feelings that are going around right now?
Well, obviously there's anxiety, anxiousness, similar words, but synonyms of those words. But there's also a lot of frustration with the judgment, and Kira Bell, it's not really Kira Bell's fault, but there's a lot of strong opinions about what's happened.
I think it's the fact that one person's experience
is deciding everybody else's, and that's not fair.
Aislinn, let's ask you something fun, because we've asked you some pretty dark things about your healthcare situation. What are your plans when you get past the 18 mark? Is it a university thing? Is it going to be like a work thing? Or do you have no idea which...
I have a sort of vague idea of what I want to do. I want to be a runway model. I'm tall enough. I think I could maybe hopefully bring some diversity into the industry, which would probably actually be an advantage on my side. I want to live in New York.
You've been watching loads of Pose.
Definitely. And I want to...
So you watch Pose? You a fan?
Yeah.
Oh,
Favorite
it's
show.
so good. It's so good. People listening, if you haven't watched Pose yet, and you haven't actually heard me rant about Pose yet, which if you haven't, where have you been? That's all I do. Watch it now. It's all on iPlayer. Go, 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 go. So did you find yourself being inspired by all of the sashaying and all of that? You want to try and bring some of that to the runways of New York?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I know I wanted to do some sort of, I've always sort of like been drawn to that whole glamorous modeling thing. I just never really had the confidence to, but now that I do, and yeah, Pose has definitely inspired me a lot. But it's not like the only reason I want to do it or anything.
I think that if it was, it's a really good reason. Like, if it was, but I understand what you mean. That it seems to be something of a calling, and is there some kind of aspect to wanting to wear some works of art? Is that an angle?
Definitely, yeah.
And then, of course, I'm the doom and gloom monger saying, but you've got to do your GCSEs and get your A-levels and have something to fall back on.
Exactly what you sound like.
Yeah, exactly what I
would say that would probably be, like, not the worst thing to do, but then, because, you know, you may go into something and then suddenly fall in love with a completely different subject. Like, that's something that can happen. That definitely happened to me. At 16, I had no idea, and I was just like, oh, I'll do media. And I was like, oh, I like this. I like reading about things and looking things up and stuff. So, you know, I would say don't close any doors, but this is just me being an old and being condescending and giving you advice you probably already know. Once this, however it wraps up, whether it wraps up for you with the judgment, with the judge being like, yeah, go for it, or whether the case is reversed, how do you think adult trans people who are listening, who do not tend to have any transgender kids, probably don't know any, may not even have met any knowingly, what could they do to support people like you, Ashlyn?
They could listen to us and what we have to say instead of, because we get talked about quite often, but there's nobody who really listens. Not nobody, but in terms of like the media and people could probably get very bad ideas about our community just from reading articles, because there's not a lot of positive stuff.
Yeah, I think my biggest frustrations, I've used frustrations a lot in this podcast, I'm sorry, but it's the way that young people like Ashlyn are talked about, you know, born in the wrong body, you know, kind of everything's doom and gloom and misery. And you know what? Give young people the support they need.
And it won't be doom and gloom.
And it won't, give them the access at the appropriate stages to the correct pathways, and they'll thrive.
Yeah.
And lots of trans adults were trans kids. Just maybe remember what that feeling was like, I think.
Ashlyn, you may be surprised to know that people of my generation, we used to voluntarily sign up for doom and gloom. I don't know if you will have any understanding of what I'm talking about here, but a lot of people of my generation dressed up as vampires when we were your age. We used to call ourselves goths. That is a thing. Look it up. Google it. Like, I promise you this is true. Yeah. Like, I was walking around my college and suddenly it's like, oh, my friend Phoebe's now gone goth. She looks like a character from an Anne Rice novel now. And that was just normal. That was just the early 2000s, just post 9/11. That's what that was. So I guess what I'm saying is my generation was silly and we just upped our own misery for no apparent reason because we thought it looked cool. But yeah, thank you both very much for sharing what you have to say and for talking to me. And yeah, I understand totally that this is not without risk because parents of trans kids have been targeted before and trans kids themselves have been so not believed, not listened to, that I would have understood if you were just like, well, what's the point? It's dangerous and I'm just going to be talked over by people. So I really appreciate you sharing all of this stuff with me and the audience.
Just sort of like, please take into account what I've said, because it's not just me. There's a lot of people who it's like, I don't know how many people there are in the world, but there's a lot of us that were the people in the world. So
I think there's about 200 youths who currently have prescriptions for blockers out of the Tavistock, and I think there's about 4,000 odd people on their books at this point. So
yeah,
in the grand scheme, not huge numbers, but, you know, it's basically you could fill a stadium.
Yeah. And every one of them has the right to a happy, thriving life and opportunity, don't they? I think sometimes people think, why should we care? It's such a small part of society. Well, what if it's your cousin, daughter, niece, nephew? We're talking about human beings and their right to make decisions about their lives and have bodily autonomy. How is that a bad thing?
Penny and Ashlyn, thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. It's been lovely to chat.
So I think that was quite an insightful interview, wasn't it, really? Because at the end of the day, what it brings home, and what we would hope that all of this that we do tries to bring home, is the fact that trans people are people, and we have lives, and we have ambitions, and we have things that we want to do in our lives that actually may or may not have anything to do with being trans. We still have ambitions for what we want to work in, or, you know, things we want to spend our time doing, like art and music and whatever. We've got all of those things as well as being trans. And I think that interview is just a very nice little window into the fact that that's the case. And again, Ashlyn said, didn't she, that so often there is media coverage about trans kids, but there is not media coverage of trans kids as such. Very few people actually sit down and speak to the people who are being affected. It's just constantly being talked over. And trans adults know something of that experience as well, of course. Like, you know, all these articles and things being put forward that have never spoken to a trans person and yet claim to know the details. And I also did like your reference to the goth culture of the early 2000s, but of course you're not a proper goth unless you invade and sack Rome in 410 AD.
I've talked to a few youngsters now. I'm really aging myself up by saying the phrase youngsters. Yeah. And they had no idea that goths were a thing, and they just don't believe me. Like, I've said this to a few people around Ashlyn's age bracket, just like, yeah, you know, when we were teenagers, occasionally someone would show up to college and just be like, oh, you dress like a vampire now, that's your thing. And they're just like, what is your generation? I'm like, I don't know, man. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah. And well,
it was very strange post 9/11, you know, it was a really strange time.
It really was. But then there was like something that I saw actually only this morning on the internets was like a professor speaking in class and saying, do emo kids still exist? And then a student puts their hand up and says, yeah, but that's just everyone now. It's like, okay, yeah, that sounds legit.
But yeah, when it gets to the meat of things of that,
let's pull it back.
Pull it back. Yeah. What struck me was that they were both very, very stoic in the face of a very uncertain time, and that was really surprising to me. And what also, when I was asking around trying to find like some kids who were affected, because there's like maybe less than 200 kids who are directly affected at the moment.
Yeah.
There is a culture of fear. So many wouldn't. Like, I didn't talk to a lot of them directly. I went through other people, and like people I've talked to who are like in parents groups on WhatsApps and stuff, just like, does anyone want to talk out about this? And the thing is, it's like, well, like I said to them, it's a very, very brave thing to come step forward, even for a podcast with a smaller audience like ours. It's incredibly brave. And what struck me is that like they don't know what the deal is. They don't know if they're going to have to go into a court or whether it's going to be something they do entirely over the post. They don't know if they're going to need to get a solicitor or they need to pay money.
Or if they're going to have to pay for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Next week is more fun. Next week is a Sister Live special that is about a year late. We speak to Grace Petrie, leftist folk superstar, who has been very patient because I literally spoke to her 12 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I spoke to David Paisley, who was famous for being on BBC Scotland's River City, actually a soap opera that I sat down and enjoyed. And I don't really like soap operas, but River City's pretty good. He was famous for essentially fighting the LGBT Alliance in Scotland. And he's very patient too, because he's waited about 8 months for this episode to come out. But yeah, so next week it will be more fun.
We hope. And we will carry on producing fun, insightful, and above all, snarky content that we know you've all come to know and tolerate. However...
yeah, if you want to get some of that tolerable snark, you can get us on our website, whatthetrans.com. We're on all of the social things, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, /whatthetrans. I'm also trying to learn how to use Snapchat because Ben at Peak News said, you need to get on Snapchat. And I was like, alright, fine. I'm 35, but fine.
But okay.
If anyone knows how to use Snapchat, please teach me, because I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. But yeah, thanks for listening and have a good week.
Goodbye.
Bye.
This episode of What the Trans was produced by Ashley Talbot and Michelle Snow and was edited by Michelle Snow and Mara Reynolds, who you can catch on Twitter at Chai Tiefling. We would also like to thank our Patreon producers, who are CB Bailey,
Gordon Cameron,
Peter Kimball,
Rachel T.S.,
Constance Turner,
Vic Parsons,
Joel Lewis,
Tila Wild,
Atom James,
Vanessa Billington,
Tower Watch,
Rowan Littlejohns,
Desiree Markland,
Patreon user, so mysterious,
Derek Victor,
Sarah Bedfull of Dogs Halliwell,
Emma Doyle,
Mike Dickinson,
Owen Willis,
Catherine,
Elliot McVeigh,
Cassius Adair,
Tuck,
Melissa Brooks,
Ian Coomber,
Maddie Bell,
Karakan 12,
April Haller,
Sophie Lewis,
Alexandra Lilly,
Claire Scott,
Ariadne Pena,
Lauren O'Nions,
Mara Reynolds,
Bernard's Pink Jellybean,
and Lanos. Thank you so much for supporting us. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.
Bye.